so I'm going to talk about a project I did using Node in order to teach other people GitHub and some of the things I learned along the way in working with the GitHub API and creating a bot to work with people who are learning GitHub for the first time. And I'm Jessica. As I just said, I'm a front-end developer at GitHub, and I also love Node and JavaScript, write a lot of open source, and I live in Oakland, sunny and flat and warm there. Alright, so once a year in Northern California, more north than Oakland, here in this ideal setting is NodeConf. It's a conference for Node. And in 2013's NodeConf, the format changed so that instead of talks, every session was a workshop. So everyone did hands-on coding. And Substack and Max, who are here, they ran a workshop on Node streams. And James Substack wrote a terminal app called Stream Adventure that you would run in your terminal and you would go through these lessons for learning how to interact with Node streams. And so it looked something like this, similar terminal app, and it was awesome. People had a lot of fun with it. And so then another guy, Rod Bag, then created a framework called Workshopper, which makes it really easy to create these apps of lessons that run in terminal. So then that was like a gateway, and people started building a lot of these workshops, and that's how NodeSchool.io was born, which has been talked about a few times now. So it's another shout out to NodeSchool. But NodeSchool now has 18 local chapters where people host hack nights, where people work through some of these lessons. There have been 72 events, and there are now 20+ workshoppers on different topics around most of them are Node, but some of them are fundamental JavaScript stuff, and then like mine is on Git, so there's all kinds of cool stuff there. So meanwhile, back at GitHub, at that time last year, I was working with a group to work with new users and thinking about what is it like to be someone who's totally new to coding, totally new to GitHub version control, and to sign up for GitHub. And we were pretty self-aware that it wasn't a really good process. There's not a lot of tools to teach you Git concepts, and so signing up is easy, creating a username is easy, but then you have to try and figure out what's a fork, what's a commit, pull requests, and doing things out in the open in front of everyone. These things are terrifying. So the drop-off rate for people who signed up for GitHub and then never came back, it was a pretty big amount of people, because I think we benefited from the fact that up until this point, a lot of existing developers joined GitHub. So when they joined GitHub, they either were already using Git or they understood version control, so they were able to join GitHub and get it, and just use things, and they understood things. But now there's a lot of people who are trying to learn to code or are working in offices where they work with people who use GitHub, and so they want to use GitHub too. There's not a lot there to help you do that. And so we were wondering, what if we could have a hack night that GitHub hosted that was just all about teaching Git and GitHub to newcomers, and how cool would it be if the goal was that everyone left with their first pull request merge, right? And you would have this green square on your contribution graph. It was like tangible things you could go home and feel like you had crossed that hurdle. So I was like, ooh, I could build a workshopper for that. Because I had gone to these ones at NodeConf, and I thought they were really cool. So I volunteered for the task to start hosting these workshops. And I thought, one of the benefits of using the terminal apps is that they're in terminal. So you're using real Git, real GitHub, and real terminal, obviously. And so users get to actually get over that hurdle versus an emulator in which you're doing the stuff, but then when you finish, you still have to install Git on your system. You still need to go onto GitHub and make a real pull request in the wild, So even though you're learning those things, you still have hurdles after that. So I thought it could be really awesome that this thing's already in terminal, so we're already using all the real stuff. it quickly became a bigger project than I thought it was going to be, and it evolved into 4 different projects with their own repositories. And so the parts of Git are, there's the terminal app, and the terminal app is that workshopper framework that loads the menu and loads the challenges and verifies challenges. Then I have a static website that's the guide for each challenge that actually tells everyone what a branch is or what a local repository is compared to a remote repository. Then there is the repository that everyone's going to fork when they're doing the challenges, which is a whole other repo. And then there's Reba Robot, which I will talk about later, but he becomes the collaborator for everyone. And I'm totally going to skip what could be another talk all on its own about how to teach people Git and GitHub. These concepts are pretty crazy. Sometimes you just have to tell people, just accept it. This is what it is. Don't ask why. Just accept it and type it over and over. And so, yeah, I could do a whole other talk on all the iterations that have happened in the last year of how do we explain branches? What's the best way to have someone fork a project or explain a pull request? It's crazy. All right, so part 1, setting up the framework. This is the workshopper framework I talked about that was written by Rod Bag. I needed to fork it because I actually won't be verifying any files that people write because this isn't JavaScript, right? People aren't learning to write JavaScript and we aren't comparing their JavaScript to what we expect. So typically in a workshopper, you have someone write a JavaScript program and then you evaluate it compared to the expected program. But like I said, like people aren't writing programs. We're just trying to verify how they're using Git. So what I do is I add a verify.js file in each of the challenges. And with that, I use a child process exec, which is in Node core. So it's a Node module that comes with Node. It's not written by anybody else. What it allows me to do is run bash commands in the background, so I can actually run Git in the background with people using Git in their terminal. So, and you run the actual command. So the way you might run Git version in your terminal, you can use exec to run Git version, and you can capture that output. So I capture the output, and then I can compare it to what I think it should be. So if I'm trying to see if someone has installed Git, I expect it to say, to return that there's a version. And so I just check that, and if it's not, then they haven't installed it. So then how every lesson in Git works is that when the user types Git verify to verify the challenge that they're on, it runs that verify.js file, and that file either runs Git in the background, it either makes a direct request to the GitHub API, or it makes a request to the Reba Robot server that I'll talk about later, which then does other things. So, Git. So this is how the lessons and making the requests and sort of ecosystem of Git works. There are 10 lessons in Git that take you from installing Git, getting it set up, creating a repository and committing to it locally on your computer, then setting up a GitHub account, then learning about remotes and connecting your local work to remote work, forking other projects on GitHub, setting up branches, adding a collaborator, pulling in changes from a collaborator, making the almighty pull request, and then having your pull request merged. And so, as the user is working through these challenges, the 2 things that they're interfacing with are Git in their terminal and then Patchwork, which is the repository that they're forking as they're learning these steps. But meanwhile, what's happening in the ecosystem is that Git is either talking to Git in the background, Reba Robot server, or the GitHub API, or Reba Robot's talking to the GitHub API. I'm trying to make it seem as least confusing as possible. And then some things are actually happening directly onto the Patchwork repo. So one tip is that you can add anything to your Git config file. If you wanted to do git config user.favorite color blue, you could do that. And so one thing that I needed was I was going to need to know what people's GitHub username was so that I could verify some of the things they're doing. So during the challenges, I have them set up git config user.username. Typically you do .user or .email, but doing .username makes it so that I can access people's GitHub username. So the same way I could then type git config user.username in my terminal and it would return JLord. I can then use exec to run in the background the same command, capture someone's username, and then make a request to GitHub to check and see if that user had done what they're supposed to do. So request. I use request, which is a pretty popular request module on NPM for making most of the requests in Git. And to do that, I just require request. And so for most of the stuff in Git, I'm just reading public repositories. So the options I set up initially are pretty simple. But you can see here, this is for the challenge where I check to see that they've set up a GitHub account. So I actually just check to see if that user exists. And if the user doesn't exist, then I log out to their terminal that I couldn't find their username. All right, next part is Reba Robot, because it wouldn't be GitHub if you did not collaborate with people or get to work with other projects. So Reba Robot started as just someone I wanted to have collaborate with people, but then he ended up taking on a lot of other jobs. Oh, this is Reba Robot. He's a cat from space. And he has a GitHub account and he's pretty active. But what's pretty incredible to me is this means almost every day someone does Git it, which is nuts. So Reba Robot is a cat from space, but he's also a Node server. It lives on a DigitalOcean droplet, which are only $5 a month. And I use a repo called Taco by Max Ogden to Git deploy. And then the requests I make to GitHub, I use either this confusing, both people are named Michael but spelled differently, Michael/GitHub or Michael/request for making requests to the GitHub API. And so all the jobs that Reba Robot has, in Git, he's verifying 2 of the challenges. He verifies if a PR was made and if you added him as a collaborator. So that's when he's checking the GitHub API. But he's also receiving webhooks from the repo. He writes to repositories. He evaluates all the pull requests that come in as a part of the Git challenge. If the pull requests aren't correct, he writes comments on the pull requests. He then merges the pull requests if they're good. And then finally he adds that new user to the website with all the names of people who've completed it, and he rebuilds that site and pushes it to GitHub. But the very first time he acts with a user is when the user is on lesson number 8, which is to add a collaborator. So the first thing they do, because I need Reba Robot to be able to write to their repo so that they can pull in his changes, they have to add him as a collaborator. So GitHub doesn't have a webhook for knowing when you've been added as a collaborator. It would be a cool feature, but it doesn't exist right now. And so the way I had to work around that was, all we do is we send an email when you've been added to a repository. So there's a service called cloudmailin.com that allows you to connect webhooks to emails. And it actually all works pretty fast. So Reba Robot's email on GitHub is this cloud mailing email. So whenever GitHub sends an email to him saying you've been added to a repository, it immediately sends a JSON payload to my server. And then the server can read and parse from that what GitHub user added Reba Robot. Then once he knows who added him, he knows he has read-write access to that repo and then can write to it. And then in that challenge in Git, the user has to verify. To pass the challenge, they have to verify that they added Reba Robot. And so Git is then sending this query to the Reba Robot server. And from that, I'm able to just parse out the username and then check to see, because I know the name of the repo is Patchwork, and so I'm able to grab the username and then see if Reba Robot has push permissions to that user's fork of Patchwork. and it's either true or false, so they either passed or didn't pass. So once he's been added to the repository, he then writes to their repo. So the user is asked to just create a text file with their name in it, and then Reba Robot goes in and writes over it with ASCII art in their name, which is always an improvement. So the same thing happens when Reba Robot is verifying that the user made a pull request. Git sends the same type of request to Reba Robot server where I can parse out the username, and then I look through the closed pull request, because the pull request gets closed almost, the pull requests get merged almost instantly, so I have to look through the closed pull request to find out if that user made a pull request. And it's either true or false. Another tip is, if you have a bot, a GitHub bot out there that is looking for specific things, you don't want it to respond to every single pull request that you get. So I set up a check just to see that the pull request coming in is one that I actually want to act upon, because you might have a pull request that has nothing to do with anything, and so I know, because the branch name that people are creating is set, it's going to say add and their username, so I always know to look for that type of branch name, and if the pull request doesn't come from a branch name for that, then Reba Robot will just ignore that pull request. Then, when a pull request comes in, Reba Robot gets that information because a webhook comes in saying a pull request, and it gives it all the pull request information, and then Reba Robot will actually look to see if the file name is what it was supposed to be. It looks through the patch of the pull request to see if the content is what it's supposed to be. If it's not, I've got a function called write comment where I can just pass in a message and the pull request number. So anytime something doesn't look the way Reba Robot wants it to look, I just pass a message and the pull request number to this function, and it writes a comment on the user's repo, or their pull request, saying what exactly was wrong with their pull request. Another tip, don't try and merge things all at once. Node is really good at doing things fast, but the GitHub API isn't necessarily as fast. And so whenever a pull request is getting merged, GitHub is actually doing a lot of background work on that pull request that just got merged. And so if you try to merge another one right after that, it's going to tell you it's not mergeable, even though technically it is. Like GitHub, the API will not let you merge it. So I learned the hard way that you actually need to set up a cycle of checking. And so I check every 3 seconds to see if it can be merged. And if it ends up not being merged after like 10 or something, then I give up altogether. But usually it takes like 2 or 3 3-second intervals before the GitHub API will let another pull request get merged. Then once the pull request is merged, Reba Robot takes the user's information that just completed all these challenges, and he adds them to the data in the contributor's JSON file. And then he rebuilds a static page that just uses handlebars templates, and he pushes that to a GHPages branch at jlord/patchwork, and it's this site, and this site has everyone's name on it that has completed it. And so usually we have this screen up when we do workshops, and you can watch new changes come in, and it jiggles, and you can see everyone as they are completing the page. And so far, 676 people have completed it, which is crazy. So Node is really good at doing this because we do this in workshops with like 30 people in the room at one time, and so there's any number of requests that could be coming in or going out from Reba Robot, and that's what Node was born to do. So it works really well in terms of all the async requests in and out. And this is a list of like things that, at any given time, things that could be coming into Reba Robot and things that could be coming out from Reba Robot. And then if we look back at all the lessons in Git, I tried to diagram kind of what's happening. So the first 3, I'm just running git with exec or I'm running exec with Git, running Git in the background with exec to check what the user's done with Git. The fourth one, it makes a request to the GitHub API, then using exec again, then on challenges 8 and 10, Git makes a request to Reba Robot, and then Reba Robot is then making requests to the GitHub API. Fun fact, we are going to host one of these nights here in Taipei next week. All the tickets are sold out currently, which is sad, but you can do this anytime. It's an open source project on GitHub, and all you need is your terminal to run it. The end. And then those are the repositories. So, thank you.
好，那有没有人对就是 Jessica 所讲的内容有任何问题？提出来。OK， 你是要用中文提问还是用英文
？How do you get started making this project?
Well, so like I sort of mentioned, I think this morning, I like to find projects to do so that I can learn something else. Like I had never made a server in Node before this project, and so it had always kind of been on my to-do list. So I would say the idea just kind of grew. Like once the Node School workshops started coming out, I thought, oh, it would be cool if I could make one of those, but what would my topic be? And then being that I work at GitHub and am familiar enough with Git and GitHub, I thought I could do that. And then it just kind of grew in terms of, well, how would I adapt that framework to work for people learning Git and GitHub? And then how can I make it a better Git and GitHub experience by having a collaborator and public repositories for people to work with? So it really just kind of grew from the beginning of just thinking about what to do, and then I learned each thing kind of baby steps along the way. You know, I completed a task and then learned the next thing to complete the next part. A lot of Googling, a lot of the Node docs, a lot of the benefit of me being able to go into the GitHub API chat room and be like, I'm breaking the API, why? And there's still something that's broken with the API. There's an open issue on the GitHub repository that Patchwork keeps breaking the API. So I was lucky that I could ask them questions too as I broke the API.
So I have a question for Jessica, like the workshopper. So per your experience, how much time it takes to create the patchwork, like a workshopper? And also the second question is, I know GitHub also have a Gitbook, right? I love GitHub, so I use a lot of this technology. But how do you think like both workshopper is kind of interactive tutorial and also a static Gitbook?
Yeah. Wait, so was the first question how much time did it take to make this? I would say the bulk of the work I did in like 3 weeks, like heads down. I used the lull of the holiday period last year where a lot of people were on vacation, there weren't a lot of projects active, and I had a lot of spare cycles. And I had volunteered to start hosting this thing, so I just put my head down and I worked on it every day for like 3 weeks. And so that was the bulk of it, but I still work on it all the time to improve it, fixing bugs and stuff. But the bulk of it was in 3 weeks, but like really, the very first event we did at GitHub with it was like the end of January, so I still had like another 3 weeks after that to get it sort of ready to do in public. And then the question was, well, I I guess I don't find myself ever recommending books to people, and I think a lot of people have ended up learning Git because someone sat down next to them and helped them learn Git. And we wanted to do a in-person event. So really this came about because the goal was to do an in-person event. And so we weren't just making a list of resources. Like, we intended to put people together so that they could talk about Git and GitHub. So yeah, and so I still think that learning Git is tricky enough that just one of the best, or at least fastest ways, is to have someone sitting down next to you. But that's not ideal. Like, not everyone can get someone to sit down next to them and teach them Git and GitHub. But we are actually we're learning, every time we do one of these workshops, we learn more and more how new users learn Git and GitHub. And so we are actively taking that into stuff that we're building to help improve the new user experience on GitHub. So hopefully in the future, you can still learn Git and GitHub from GitHub without having someone sit down next to you.
Oh, sharing with you.
啊，我用中文问。
好。
我的问题是，目前这个 Git 看起来像是只能在 Terminal， 然后如果它在 Windows 环境底下，或者是说在不同的 platform， 我们要怎么去解决这个问题？那如果说我下一个 project 也是想要用 Workshopper 来做之间一个 event 的话，那有什么样类似的工具可以推荐？
Okay, so Git works on Windows and Linux and Mac right now. So it will load the terminal and load the menu just the same. The only difference that we have with Git in particular is that some of the bash commands are different. So in some of the challenges where you're telling people to cd into a directory or something like that, we have a note for Windows users saying, here's what in the actual web guide for Git it says, here's what you type if you're on Windows, here's what you type if you're on Mac. But in terms of installing Git and the workshoppers, they work on both platforms. And then the second question was, if you wanted to host an event with an existing workshopper, what would you do?
就是有没有类似的工具，或者是说有没有类似的，除了 Workshopper 之外，有没有类似的工具可以来帮助整个建制？
Oh, I missed the first part of the question. I mean, Max mentioned he has the Art of Node that he's written. Substack's also written really good guides. I also think it's really great to just be casual with it and have someone get up and answer questions or start sort of live demoing, talking through things, or to say, hey, we're just going to publish an NPM module today, so let's all walk through these steps together. So you don't even necessarily need curriculum or things that have been pre-planned out that much. I think you could just think of a small task that you could have everyone do and walk them through it, if the class size is small enough.
Oh, great question.
I have a question. The projects you have done, do you ever encounter any people contribute something that you think it's not the way you want it to be, or they're going to the wrong way, feel very uncomfortable or irritated?
Wait, have I had people contribute things
It's in your project that it's not going the way that you want it to be?
Yeah, of course. I mean, people submit things, and I haven't had, no one's been bad or submitted something really huge that I disagree with, but there's been little things that I need to clarify or say I prefer to do it this way, but they've been pretty little. I do have a really small project that I know that there are like 2 open pull requests on that I've been ignoring for like a year. It's a small enough project that they really could just write their own, and they were not that nice in their pull request, so I'm not merging it. Yeah, if your pull request subject line is a joke or ironic, then the odds of me merging it are lower.
好，下一个问题。
我想问一下，如果在一个 workshop 的环境下，在通常的状况里面，你们可以 handle 的人数大概是多少人？最少到最多？那这样子决定的数量是因为什么？
Why we decided to have around 30 or so? That's usually how many people show up, actually. We have, and I think the problem varies depending on where you're at, but in San Francisco, at the GitHub office, when we host these events, just San Francisco is filled with tech companies and meetups and all this stuff. I think a lot of people are just not interested or have other options. So we know as a rule of thumb, almost 2/3 of people who RSVP will not show up. And it's a free event, so we know, and we're never going to charge for it. So we're always going to have that problem of it's a free event, so people sign up just because, but they're not really actually committed to coming. And so we usually have about 70 people sign up for the event in San Francisco, and then about 22 to 25 people come, actually, and then 10 or so people come to mentor. Yeah, so it ends up being around like 30 that actually show up.
实际上，如果是这样的状况，会让你觉得很伤心，或者是还是你会继续这样的一个 workshop 活动
Wait, will I feel sad? What?
About the rate.
Oh, do I feel bad about the dropout rate? Not really, because actually when a smaller amount of people come, one other thing is that we open up tickets for people to come as mentors, and so the way we do it at GitHub is also the way people do the Node School workshops too, is we open up tickets for attendees, people who want to come and learn, and then we open up a smaller number of tickets for people who want to mentor, like come and help people. And usually if you volunteer to help people, you're gonna actually show up. So most of the mentors always show up, but the people who just signed up for a free ticket, you know, are like, oh, I'll learn Git another week, you know, and they don't come. And so I don't feel bad about the dropout rate. I actually feel way better because when it's a small group, you get almost a 1-to-1 ratio of people, and we do a survey after every event, and people, like, it makes me almost teary-eyed. Like, people have such a good experience, they meet new people, and the people who come out to mentor genuinely want to help people, and they actually have said, you know, they want to pay it forward because someone sat down with them and taught them Git and GitHub, and they want to do that too. And so people end up with a really good experience, like working with people. And so I like the smaller crowd.
Okay, well, I do have maybe a little question about, you mentioned earlier you're probably not going to cover some, you know, how to do GitHub for beginners, but as a real beginner and sort of new to JavaScript, can you maybe give a brief introduction of that?
Oh yeah, so Git is a version control system that was written about 10 years ago by the guy who wrote the Linux operating system. And version control is a way of tracking your changes over time. So if you've used Microsoft Word, it has a similar feature where you can track changes and see who changed what when. Git allows you to do the same kind of thing, but with the code you're writing. And so it used to be that everyone would have Git on their computer, and they would be working with their own code, versioning their own code on their computer. But if I wrote a project, I would just have to post about a project on a website, and someone would have to see it and then maybe email me and be like, hey, could you send me that code? Or, hey, I had an idea, and it gets trapped in a two-way conversation just in email, right? So if I end up in an email conversation with somebody and we're talking about this feature, meanwhile someone else over here is writing about it, and there are forums and things, and there were ways to sort of be more open about it, but it was still not an ideal way, or it wasn't as good as it could be. So then GitHub came around to actually build an interface on top of Git and a central place for the code to live, so that people could share their code together and have an interface that made it really easy to view code, comment on code, suggest changes to code. And so that's really generally what Git and GitHub are. And GitHub added some things to, there's some things that just exist in GitHub. So like a pull request is a term that GitHub came up with to describe, I have a change to make to your code. So I'm actually requesting you pull in my changes to your code. It's sort of a weird term, but so there are things like that that exist because GitHub came up with that term, right? And so that's something we have to explain to beginners, and is sometimes a confusing concept also because it's poorly named. But then there are things that in Git are also confusing to, like understanding branches so that you can work on two things at one time. And then when you're done working on this one thing, you can merge it back into the other one.
Okay. So,
oh, wait, can I add that also with Git, one of the things I wanted to do was make sure that the barrier to entry was as low as possible, so you don't need to know how to code to do Git. You learn to use the terminal and stuff, but you follow the commands. Like each thing you type in the terminal is explained to you, and you type it after you read about it and learn it. And you're not typing any code. The files that you're adding are text files with your name in it, and so you don't need to know any code to do Git.
Okay, so as you mentioned earlier, you was using the example of GitHub, but as a JavaScript learner, there will be certain learning curve that is, surely they will encounter some difficulty during for beginners especially. So, will there be some advice or tips you want to give to these beginners for them to maybe share a few words to encourage them?
For learning JavaScript?
Yeah.
Build as many things as you have ideas. That's what I think. And one of the most important sort of parts I think of learning to code is when you hit the point where you know enough that you know what to Google. Because every problem that you're going to have, someone else has already had, and the answer is online. So you don't even need to become an expert to get to the point where you can solve your own problems, because even if you are an expert programmer, and no one's an expert programmer, because everyone has something to learn. But even when you know most of what you're doing, you still have to Google things, and you don't remember everything, or the last time you used it was 2 years ago. And so everyone is Googling for the answer all the time. So the key is not to actually become an expert programmer, but it's to get to that sweet spot where you know how to describe what your problem is. And then you can find the answer, and you can find a solution to it.
Jessica, I have a question. There's a recent announcement in GitHub Education about GitHub package, I believe. It's a bundle of GitHub service and maybe a DigitalOcean other services.
Are those available for Taiwan students?
Yes, absolutely. Let me see. You're talking about the student developer pack that just came out
Yeah,
this
that's
week.
right.
I don't know. The answer is yes, it's available to any student anywhere. It just checks that you have a student email address, and if for some reason you have, all right, yeah, here it is. Shout out to Moan who made this page. So yes, so the student developer pack is GitHub teamed up with a bunch of other companies to offer either free, I think they're mostly free or a lot cheaper, all of the typical developer services. And so you just sign up for the pack and you just need to verify that you're a student with your email. And if for some reason your email doesn't seem to work, you can just email support@github.com and we will fix it and manually add you in. Like if you are a student, you get these things. We want you to have them.
Okay. Thank you.
好，那让我们给 Jessica 一个热烈的掌声。